Welcome. We're TableGoth, and today we're going to talk to you about combat in Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition. Vampire, in my humble and usually correct opinion, is much less of a combat-oriented game than a lot of other TTRPGs, and that's okay. I prefer that. I'm not a big combat person. I'm more of a role play over fighting simulation and whatnot. But it has its place, and violence definitely happens in this, as well as social combat, which we probably won't get into. That should be its own video, one hopefully I don't have to do because it's a little wonky. But today we're talking about physical, violent combat, killing stuff. Combat in this, a rule I use in any game really, but Vampire especially, I would say we're going to talk about some of the storyteller standpoint things when designing encounters and whatnot. Try to keep them quick. This isn't really a game of big hit point pools or all these different maneuvers and special attacks and things that like you can use to spice up combat. Combat's very narrative in this. I've never seen someone use like a mat for Vampire. I don't think it really calls for that because you don't have a movement speed or anything like that. So think about that. Everything is narrative in this game, including the combat. So because of that, you want to keep it a short and exciting narrative thing. If you're talking about fighting people for an hour, that's not that exciting of a fight. You know, a fight's quick, deadly, fast, and usually has some sort of conclusion, good or bad, in a pretty logical time. They actually have a rule written for this. They have a lot of optional rules, which is what I like about this game. Most of it just says do what you want to do really at the end of the day. They do a rule of 3, which I think is I've used. It's pretty interesting. We're saying 3 rounds pretty much. If something can't be after 3 rounds of combat or so some sort of contest, you should be able to see like, okay, this person's winning or this person will probably end up doing this. At that point, you as a storyteller sort of take over and be like, all right, this happens, you're on your way. If your players are about to win, instead of just making them do an extra few rounds, just to whittle down a little bit of damage, just have some cool narrative thing happen where they win. Even if you're not using the rule of 3, I wouldn't just have. There are rounds in this game, but rounds work a little differently in the sense that, well, again, we'll get into alternate rules. We'll talk about how I do it, which is the best way to do it, which is more narrative. There is a initiative roll you can do. There is technically so you could have this person goes at this part every round. There's also a system of like, all right, close range goes first. Anyone in hand-to-hand combat. Then we go out to further apart, and then people doing long range attacks, stuff like that. And then there's also a system, which I usually do, which is just have everyone say what their intent is. This is gonna, obviously, if you have as a storyteller really against your players, you can abuse this, but that's stupid to be like that anyway. To where I just have everyone say, okay, what do you do in this round? Not necessarily you, then you, then you. And I mean, they can say, okay, I'm gonna wait for this person to do that, but normally get everyone's intent. And then narratively, just do what makes sense. All right, here's what everyone wants to do. Let's resolve this real quick. That seems like it would take a second. Or this would set this up. Let's do that first. So do it in an order that just makes sense narratively, and that could switch up every round too. As far as who starts combat, I always just do whoever initiates it, really. If it's a static, 2 people are lined up, they're getting ready to fight, just go narratively. See what everyone wants to do, pair them up, take care of it that way. And going into the narration thing, there's not like a standard like attack, like okay, there's this attack or this special maneuver. There's disciplines, of course, that sometimes do damage, but usually you're just fighting someone with a weapon or your fist or something like that. So this is, I think, gives the players a cool chance to narrate what they want to do. A player, I don't think, should really be like, okay, I attack. Because that's not like a move in this as a standard attack. Say like, I want to grab him and do this, or I want to punch him in the face, or I want to try to shoot this out of his hand. Just have your players just say what you're doing rather than look for a list of like, all right, here's the things I can do. Again, use your narration, use your imagination, say what you want to do, and the storyteller should be able to tell you what to roll for that. Along those lines, I think it's okay to, because there's not necessarily time works wonky in combat. It's not like in D&D where a round is 6 seconds, 10 seconds. It's up to you narrative what happens. Someone might say, okay, I'm going to hit him with a bat. That means they could be doing 4 or 5 swings. You just really leave it up to one roll. Going to the narration, some people are better at narrating really interesting things they want to do in a fight that are probably well outside what you would consider a standard attack, and that's just fine too. Those are things you just got to get creative with and roll with. And I think that's a good way to sort of make Vampire fun combat-wise, is just to get really creative and narrative with what you're trying to accomplish. Even if what you're trying to accomplish is just to kill the other person, how? That says a lot about your character too, is how they behave in combat, how brutal they are, what methods they use, rather than, okay, I do an attack and I want to do this much damage.
I think for me, like, just from a player standpoint, I like to play it as just one big story. So even when I'm doing combat, it's not about the combat, it's about the story. It's like I have like this cinematographic, like this thing in my head that I'm seeing, and it goes along with how the story's been going. And so sometimes I think it's nice to be able to deviate from that, like, points based, like rolling for attacks, because you can tell a story with every move you make, and there's a visual that not only like the storyteller gets but the players around the table get, and if you're streaming, that means like your audience gets a bigger picture, and it's not just like, knocking someone over the head with a bat or shooting them or whatever you're doing. I think that's nice. It's about how you tell what you're about to do. I really like that part of it. It gives it a little more freedom as far as imagination and that kind of thing goes.
Yeah, that's what I think is really cool about this setting too, is if you were to do that, you could do that in any system. Again, D&D is one everyone knows. That's the example I always use. You can, every attack in D&D, be like, okay, I swing my sword this way, I do that, which is cool and can add a lot. But also in D&D, if you're having a whole combat encounter, and every time someone has this whole narration of what their attack is, it's like, cool, there's 6 hit points, we got 120 left. Yeah, it loses its cool factor very quickly. That's why
the pacing changes.
Yes.
Where I feel like in Vampire, you can keep the same pacing by telling the story rather than just like notch here or there.
Exactly.
It keeps a very like story based element to it, and that's why the pacing feels the same. Even if it takes longer to describe it, it's still the same type of description that you've had the entire time. So
yeah,
I think that's cool.
And remember, violence in this game is kind of an extreme thing. It's not like you don't have an adventuring day where you should have 6 to 8 encounters. You usually aren't wanting to be fighting people unless that's your character, and then find a reason to kill people. That's fine too. But I mean, usually you're not gonna have a whole coterie of bruisers. So there's definitely as much, if not more, going to avoiding fights or really getting the upper hand. From a storyteller standpoint, you worry about in D&D a balanced encounter. That's not really a thing in Vampire, because no one plays fair. That's the whole thing. Everyone's trying to outwit each other, set up things in their advantage. Ideally, your players are setting up situations where it's not fair, and they just might completely wreck your enemies. Reward them for that. That's fine. Because again, it's not about the encounter, it's about the narration. It's about them setting up, moving those pieces to make it to where that fight was easy for them. So it doesn't make it a weak or boring fight, it makes it a cool story.
Because it's about what happens after the fight. Because everything, like you're saying, like a chess game, everything's about what happens after that initial encounter. So just because it wasn't exciting or whatever, it changes the entire dynamic for the rest of the story. Everything is a moving piece, and you want it to play into something else. It's for a purpose. Like, you're not having a fight just to have a fight, or to like take something. It's about how that's going to affect your position in the city or in the coterie or whatever. It all plays out for a longer purpose.
Yeah, and usually in most games your setting's a city. So if someone dies or is hurt in a city, like, you're close to the ripple effect of that, rather than you slayed a monster out in the woods. You've killed someone in your city.
You have a small community, so everything has a reason and effect to that.
Yeah, everything is a chance to come back to bite you. If you do have a group, some groups like a little bit of crunch in their combat, which is fine. The game does give you some interesting options for attacks and different maneuvers. Like I said, there's not really a standard list of attacks you could do, but there are certain things. There's an all-out attack, all-out defense. You could do a maneuver. There's a whole list of things that we could get into, but that's not really this video as much as the whole idea of combat in the game. So if you have a crunchier group, or a group that just really likes to do a little more mechanics in their fight, this system supports that. Not as much as other games, but again, that's not really the intent, I feel like, for this as in other games. But the rules are there for all that stuff of shooting a gun versus someone being next to you, and they're for those who really want that level. You don't have to make it all up yourself. They actually do it for you. It does come into play plenty of times. I mostly, especially bring into play if someone has a discipline or ability that really would affect something. Then you want to give everyone an opportunity to actually have their stuff. And this is a game to where disciplines where I know some of the old guard definitely have issues within this version. There's less superpowers, I feel like, is how I categorize a lot of the old disciplines. This one has a lot more situational or social ones. So there's not a lot of, well, I'm a vampire, I'll win because I got this list of powers. Some vampires aren't great at combat at all, but they'll get there and they will learn or they will find creative ways to get through the situation when fights do arise. I think in our Taste of Youth game, I think it was more combat heavy than most I see.
I think it has a lot of combat in comparison. Just a little
Yeah.
bit I've watched. And I feel like it's very balanced though. You can have like that action that your group's probably wanting a little bit, especially if they play like D&D or something like that. But it has a really good balance of like conversation and maneuvering and all that stuff you have to get to the combat. We just we cause a lot of problems, so I think that's part of why we have more combat.
Comes back on you, but, and it's sort of a more violent setting. But I mean, I run, I think, in my opinion, a combat heavy thing, and it's still I think I try to do my best not to have it bogged down, and it's definitely not an every episode thing. To where I mean, it's normal to go multiple sessions. If you're storytelling, like, oh, I need to put a fight in here. It's pretty normal to go multiple sessions without any fight. But again, feel out your players. If you have players who made characters that are all their disciplines are designed to just rip people apart and they never get to rip someone apart, that's not fun for them. So you'll want to adjust accordingly. Or you can have a group to where no one's designed to hurt anyone, and then they keep getting into trouble, then they slowly have to pick things up, like a samurai sword, or
or you get really good with guns.
Yeah,
or kind of good with guns, but just lucky with dice.
Try to get creative on how to deal with violence when it comes. Or something I use, because the coterie they built in Taste of Youth wasn't very combat oriented, but you guys are good at making enemies and allies. There's a lot of situations where it's a game of NPCs and of bartering and stuff. So there's been moments where you call in the troops and you get people to help, which again made encounters that weren't balanced by any means, but that was fine. They earned it by doing the social and the role play to bring people who can fight in on their side.
Yeah,
and stick them on those people. It's
a really good like show of how the game is balanced to be very socially heavy and have those opportunities for really great battles. And if you don't focus on one or the other, then you miss out a lot on like the great like combination of the two. Like if you don't we talked about NPCs in another video. If you don't focus on creating cool relationships with them, then you miss out on that getting to see what other vampires can do, what other kindred have the abilities to do, and that's always really cool. I like getting to see the entire community, the different skills and powers that people have. That's a really cool part of it, having that culmination in battles where you built allies and things like that.
Yeah. See what they show off their disciplines. Especially when people have the same disciplines as you, and they show you other ways to use them.
I should use that eventually.
One day. And from a storyteller standpoint too, there's not a monster manual. There's not a list of enemy types. They're fighting typically humans or vampires or ghouls. As well. I mean, there's obviously there's all sorts of other things you can throw in there, but I think those are going to be less frequent. So, again, you have to think narratively. You can't think of okay, this week we're going to fight this type of enemy. This week this. They need to be fighting fleshed out people. A fight's more interesting if there's a reason behind it, if they know their enemy, and there's sort of that role play aspect. There's certain ways to throw goons at it. There's Second Inquisition, just enforcers, or just ghouls with clubs. So there are cases of that. But usually they're there for a reason. A lot of fights, I said, are against other kindred. Instead of just fighting generic kindred, I'm fighting so-and-so who's wants to fight me because of this, this, and this. Or if I kill them, this person's going to be mad, and this person's going to be happy. So really, you're when you're setting up a fight, think about who they're fighting. Instead of an enemy type, you want them to be fighting for... This is a personality, really.
Mm-hmm.
Shifting over to sort of the player side of things a little bit, something I learned early on for my first time running this was that you are a vampire, a monster, you have these powers, but you could still get your ass beat by a not that remarkable
frequently
human.
Get your ass beat.
Because how the system works is if you're in a combat role, whoever gets the higher roll, they do the damage. So it's not like as a vampire you could slowly whittle them down. If you're not beating the rolls, if they have more dice than you, there's a good chance you're... That's the one sort of wonky thing about the combat. There's a good chance you're never really going to do anything to them. As a vampire, you can take way more punishment, which is nice. It gives you some leeway. But if you're a vampire with no combat skills and you get a fist fight with someone, there's a good chance you're not really going to get a lick on them if they're better at fighting. So that's where you have to sort of resort to disciplines or social maneuvering your way out of that situation. Or just getting lucky. And like I said, you could take beating, so maybe. We had early on, not to spoil anything if you don't watch our campaign, but we had one of our kindred receive a stomping just by someone's dad. Someone's...
Oh, that was good. It wasn't about me, so it was hilarious.
Might have been our first encounter in that aspect. But yeah, got in a fist fight with someone's dad. And
just got beat.
Yeah, he was not a brawling character. And that's when I realized, I'm like, oh, he's about to kill this guy. This dad's about to... I'm like, this is the boss. I'm like, we've already reached the boss because...
This is someone's mortal dad.
Yeah, who just caught him sneaking around. Yeah. that can work, which at first felt, and that's some people's complaint, is they want to play edgy superheroes. I want to be this monster like no human could stand against me. Which, if you build as a player, if you build your person for combat, you'll absolutely beat any human.
Yeah.
You won't have any problem, especially if you have... There's a lot of powers we could get into that do that. Or if you're stat supported. If you're decent at fighting, you run into other people decent at fighting, because you could take so much more punishment, you'll eventually beat them. But yeah, if there's a lot of very fun, viable builds of vampires that if someone just runs up and swings on them, they're in trouble if they don't have the right ways. And you have to worry about the Masquerade. So you might have a cool discipline that'll save you, but if there's people around, you can't... Like, good luck getting that power off in a way that's won't get you in trouble later by other people. So don't think of this again. Combat, I don't think is the main thing in Vampire. And so as a player, you definitely... As a session 0 talk, I think, that we didn't really have about the combat, but...
Yeah. I don't think we had any expectations either.
I didn't realize
it worked out
okay.
Okay.
Fight, that was like, ooh. And that character later bought a samurai sword, so he wouldn't...
Well, it's a monster you created. We can blame that on you now.
So he wouldn't get beat up. No, nothing's my fault. So that's sort of an aspect. But that same character who might get his ass beat by someone's dad also could do something like create magical stones, attract people, and do all sorts of really cool things outside of just fist fighting someone. So that's, again, read your players, get an idea of their character's abilities.
And setting that expectation at session 0. I'm a huge believer in setting expectations, like, before you get started in anything in the world. And so I think it's great to be like, hey, this is kind of what we're looking at. What are your expectations? And then, like, figuring it out from there. But it's also really, I think, important to remember, like, just, like you were saying, like, just because you're not combat heavy as a character doesn't mean you're not super useful in every other more common arena of the game. And you can balance out your powers as you go along. And I think that's a neat thing, is especially playing like somebody who has the potential to be really, really powerful. You don't have to start out that way. And that's it's a narrative. So you start out, and you grow your powers. And that's the great thing about a story, is that that development and learning those new things and figuring out what you like and don't like as a character and going along.
Yeah, that's a good point too. And going into the character building aspect is the cool thing that I love about the skill system is you put your experience where you want it. So there's no levels. It's not like, oh, I'm a sorcerer and I want to be able to fist fight someone, so I got to find a way to multi-class. And this, just find a reason. The story. I mean, that's what they did. They found a reason. her character decided to start getting knife training from someone. One character got a sword. One character just bought a gun, and used a little bit of XP to practice with it. So it's really cool. You can shift and just take little dips here and there to round out your character, and it's cool that you can make a reactionary character. Yeah, it's getting a little out of combat, but is what it is. But again, if your group is a combat heavy, I play in a Sabat game where we're all just bruisers and just wreck anyone that's in our way unless they're also crazy powerful, and that's fun too. And that, talking about just going with the flow as a storyteller and making quick narrative, once you get so powerful, there's a lot of times where I know other storytellers did it when we were playing, because you could tell once they have so many successes and stuff, instead of me keeping track of like, okay, that's my dots, narration over everything. I think the story takes precedence, and if they did something super cool and badass with their powers or whatever, or came up with a really clever maneuver, I'm not the type of person to be like, oh man, you got him for 4 damage, if you had done 5 they would have died. In my mind, I'm like, that's a really cool way to finish them off. Yeah, they're done. Because again, another round, it'd have the same result, just less cool.
Emphasis, yeah.
So I rule of cool applies to any game. I think this, especially in a narrative combat, I really put a lot of weight into creative, interesting things, if the dice are there. And because of the blood, the hunger system and all of that, sometimes it's really fun to let them try things and it goes horribly wrong, and the beast reacts and stuff. So
I've never done that.
No. I mean, you were new to the game. Was there anything in your first combat or stuff that you were confused about, or any adjustment you thought was a little hard to get, that you would have liked knowing going in?
Not really. I'm fairly new to tabletop games in general, so some of that was just, learning the basics of a general system. But I guess, remembering to add my dice, my hunger dice, and sometimes was a little confusing, which is a really basic thing, and once you get used to it, it's fine. And just, or figuring out different ways to use my disciplines in order to help me in certain things that I was doing. You can, kind of add those on top of one another with different things that you're doing in combat, but it's really all individually based, and doing social maneuvers really helps you to learn how to use all those well. So again, everything just builds on itself in the game, and becoming more comfortable with one allows you to become more comfortable with another. And don't be afraid to ask questions. Ask a lot of questions when we play, because I want to make sure I have it right, and understand how each piece connects to the next. So just ask questions, and your fellow players and storytellers can really help you out with that, and then you understand the game better as a whole. That'd be my only thing.
Yeah, I think that's good advice in general, really. I can't think of a lot. Just hitting the basics is, it's, again, a narrative combat game. Keep it short, keep it cool. Describe what you're doing. Understand if your players are built for combat or not. And that'll help with your balancing, because like I said, one character could tear through a room full of armed men and be just fine, and one character and one dad might be enough to stop them in their tracks. So again, it's not really think of balance, it's think of different people are good at different things. And because combat isn't integral to this system like it is in other systems, not every character is going to come with that survivability, let's say, in certain situations. Like I said, the actual combat system, it's like everything else. It's just, you just need to get more successes than the person you're fighting, really. So it's really simple running-wise, I think, to know. And from a player, you don't have to worry about modifiers or this or that. Or I could say add a dice, take a dice away, but roll the 2 things you're asked, and that number versus their number. So it's actually really simple, and it's easy to keep things quick narrative-wise, because you don't have to worry about all these little things affecting the roll as much as you would in other games. Another big thing about combat is mortality in this. Obviously, you're not going to die of natural causes as a vampire. Really, the only crunch system you have to realize as a storyteller is the difference between aggravated damage and non-lethal. Obviously, vampires can take a beating, getting shot, hit, anything that really doesn't involve fire or magic, they'll be okay. For the most part. But once you learn the difference between those 2 types, and that's a cool narrative thing too, is there's not a lot of things that could do aggravated damage, so it's always a cool moment if a one of your players takes aggravated damage or something, like, oh shit, that's actually serious.
I take that a lot.
Yeah,
I feel
know.
like it should be less
You
common
find your
in our
ways
game.
into finding it. But yeah, it's sort of a cool oh shit scenario and figuring things out from there. So there's a lot more crunch we could get into. Maybe we'll do a crunchier combat video at some point.
Talk torpor and things like that.
Yeah, the actual effects of combat and dying and whatnot. But this was more of an overall, I think, of how combat works in the game as a whole. Okay. Any specific questions you have, let us know. Maybe we'll cover them later. I don't love crunch, but it might be worth a different video. We'll see. Okay, that's it for me. We didn't say our names, but here we are with our outros and our names. I'm Bully.
And I'm Mandy Morose.
And we're TableGoth. And that's it for now. Bye.